The African Deep Dive podcast is brought to you by the African Technology Policy Studies Network. This podcast explores how science, technology, and innovation can drive sustainable development and global inclusion in Africa.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We're diving into a really rich policy brief today. It's focused on something that, well, often flies under the radar: social innovation. And specifically within the African context, the title is Social Innovation, an Untapped Resource for Inclusive Growth in Africa.
Yeah, it's a really essential piece of research, I think, particularly because it grapples with the sheer scale of the challenges we're all facing now. You know, climate events, persistent poverty, financial crises, these aren't small problems. They require systemic transformation, not just fiddling around the edges.
Right.
So the mission here, as laid out in the source material, is really to understand why they argue social innovation is so crucial for sustainable development, for inclusive growth.
Yeah.
Especially for the most vulnerable populations. They use the term bottom of the pyramid, or BOP.
Okay, so innovation. It's a word we hear constantly, right? It can mean almost anything. A new app, maybe a slightly different meeting format. How is social innovation really different? It's just doing good stuff. Yeah. Charity.
That's a great question, and it's the critical distinction, really. It's way beyond just charity or like corporate social responsibility. The brief's core idea, the definition they use, is that innovation succeeds only when it creates new pathways for solving entrenched social problems, resulting in lasting transformation of the systems that most affect vulnerable populations and leave stronger social relations in their wake.
Okay, lasting transformation of systems. That sounds key. So the takeaway is, like, profit might happen, but it's secondary. Systemic social change, that's the real measure of success here. If it doesn't transform things for vulnerable people, it doesn't count as social innovation.
Precisely, yeah. And, you know, the best examples are probably things that are so common now we forget they were once really radical social ideas. Think about mobile money transfer. M-Pesa in Africa is the classic example, right? It wasn't just a tech gadget. It solved a huge social problem. How do people, especially in rural areas, move money safely without formal banks nearby? It actually strengthened social bonds by enabling trust, securing livelihoods, that kind of thing.
And what's really interesting is that policymakers globally seem to be catching on. The brief points this out quite clearly. It mentions specific global initiatives trying to scale up these kinds of innovations. You've got Obama's Social Innovation Fund from way back in 2009, the European Commission's Social Agenda, the UK's Big Society policy. This isn't just some niche idea. It's becoming a global policy focus.
Exactly. It shows that governments are starting to understand, I think, that solving these really big challenges, things like fair trade, distance learning, zero carbon housing, even restorative justice, it requires shifting how communities work, the systems involved. It's not just about buying new technology.
So, okay, given those global examples, let's bring it back to Africa. The source material talks about Africa's economic performance, noting its resilience despite global downturns. Like, it kept a solid 5.5% average annual growth from 2005 to 2008, bounced back pretty fast after the 2009 dip, hitting 5.2% again by 2011-2012, second fastest growing continent after Asia. That quick recovery is kind of the puzzle, isn't it? How did that happen when formal economies elsewhere were really struggling?
Well, that's exactly the tension the brief explores. Officially, the success is put down to better macroeconomic policies, stability, that sort of thing. But the brief argues that the real story, maybe the untold story, is actually in the huge informal sector. A resilience driven by, well, massive, often undocumented social innovations happening among young people and women. Policy wasn't the main driver, the grassroots community was.
I see. That distinction, grassroots versus formal policies, seems to connect directly to what the brief calls multiple transitions happening on the continent. It's not just about the economy growing, it's about fundamental shifts in how things are done, like how research works, how society engages. They mentioned a key philosophical shift, moving from R&D, research and development, to R4D, research for development.
Exactly. R4D, it basically means research has to be purpose-driven. It needs to solve a defined development problem, you know, whether that's in health or farming or governance. If it doesn't do that, it kind of fails the R4D test. It pushes for applied local solutions, not just abstract science. It's a move away from just importing technology towards building real local scientific and technical skills, skills rooted in what people actually know and need there.
And maybe the most striking transition they talk about is the political one. The document mentions a shift from, well, democracies often captured by elites,
Yeah.
towards more participatory ones, where disagreements get hashed out not just in parliament, but increasingly on social media or through mass action in the streets. Social innovation is actually shifting power then.
It is, and it's fascinating how functional these digital tools have become as social innovations themselves. We've all seen how platforms like, well, Skype back in the day, Facebook, Twitter, they've fundamentally changed social interactions, how people work together across the continent. They've created these new kinds of public spaces almost.
And that connection works both ways, right?
Yeah.
Societal needs and these new behaviors are actually driving tech innovation. They influence R&D. Like if people need healthcare that's decentralized and affordable, you start seeing e-health initiatives pop up. If they need secure ways to handle small amounts of money, you get specialized e-banking or mobile money. The social need is driving the tech development.
Precisely. And the brief gives concrete examples of who's involved. Groups like the African Youth Forum for Science and Technology or the African Women Forum for Science and Technology. These show young people and women aren't just asking for help, they're building their own solutions. Using entrepreneurship skills, they're often the ones on the front lines, creating jobs, solving problems right there in rural areas or urban slums.
Okay, solving problems locally. And that leads to a couple of big impacts. The brief mentions that maybe need grounding and talks about securing livelihoods, which makes sense, but also stemming excessive rent-seeking and corruption. What does stemming excessive rent-seeking actually look like on the ground?
Yeah. Rent-seeking sounds a bit academic, doesn't it? Think of it as localized corruption kind of built into how things get distributed. So imagine a middleman between, say, a small farmer and the market. If they skim off a huge undeserved profit, that's the rent, just because they control access, well, that cripples the farmer. Social innovation can create more transparent systems, often digital ones, that connect the producer maybe directly to the buyer. It cuts out that corrupt layer. It fights corruption through transparency, basically.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Transparency as an anti-corruption tool.
Uh-oh.
But the brief also says the results are mixed. It mentions mobilizing mass action and resistance movements alongside creating jobs. That sounds almost contradictory. Is the brief saying social innovation is both good for development and something that challenges the state?
It is saying exactly that, yeah. The outcomes really range from stability, like securing livelihoods, creating jobs, all the way to mobilizing resistance. And that's why social innovation fundamentally shifts power dynamics. The very same tools that help a rural woman get finance can also empower citizens to organize incredibly quickly and hold governments accountable, completely outside the traditional, often elite-controlled channels.
Wow. Okay. So given this huge potential creating jobs, fighting corruption, enabling more democracy, why is it still called an untapped resource? Why isn't policy just pouring money into this already? That's the real so what question, leading to policy changes, I guess.
Well, the brief argues it boils down to a kind of bias. This potential is largely untapped because public policy, it still tends to focus almost entirely on high-end, capital-heavy tech innovations, things like satellites, advanced manufacturing. They often overlook the decentralized, low-cost grassroots stuff that happens in community centers or just on a mobile phone. So we need a deliberate effort and intervention to shift that policy focus.
Right. So let's lay out those key policy recommendations for you, the listener, because these seem to be the action points, the areas needing investment. First, they call for awareness creation. Basically educating policymakers and investors. They need programs to really show them the tangible value of social innovation because right now the focus seems stuck on hardware and patents.
Second, and this is absolutely crucial for these ideas to even survive, is setting up robust social impact investment for startup finance. The big recurring problem for social innovators is often creditworthiness. They might be poor, working informally, they just can't get formal bank loans. So good ideas die for lack of funds. Targeted social impact investment, which explicitly values the social return, not just financial collateral, needs to fill that funding gap.
Got it. And the third point is about structure. Social innovation incubation programs. The brief really stresses that social innovation is often collaborative, right? Different people in a community solving problems together. So incubators aren't just about money. They provide the space, the expertise, the support needed to really nurture and scale up these collaborative efforts, especially for youth and women who are often leading the charge.
Exactly. And finally, number 4 is systemic policy reforms. Existing science, technology, and innovation STI policies need a serious review. They need refocusing towards building local capacities for all kinds of innovation, including the social kind. Plus, this is tricky, strengthening intellectual property laws. We need to make sure innovators benefit, but How do you protect community-developed ideas without locking them up and limiting public access? That requires a really creative IP approach that allows broad community benefit.
Yeah, that sounds like a tough needle to thread, making sure the inventor gets something, but the solution remains accessible for the people who need it most.
It's the ultimate test of truly inclusive innovation, isn't it? The goal has to be moving away from just policies on paper towards seeing innovation as this ongoing inclusive process. And that requires significant, sustained investment in building capacity right there at the community level.
That's a really powerful way to frame it. So our final takeaway, our synthesis, seems to be that social innovation is this incredibly creative, dynamic field. It's already delivering some remarkable impacts in farming, health, finance, even how countries are governed. And the theories behind it are still evolving, which means there's huge potential for more research for development R4D to map this out and make it even more effective.
Absolutely. And maybe let's end on that provocative thought, building on the contradiction we talked about earlier. We discussed how social innovation leads to jobs and better livelihoods, but also helps mobilize resistance. So the real structural test still ahead is probably this. How will African governance systems actually adapt to the challenge that social innovation poses to establish power structures, especially now that it's giving citizens these powerful tools for decentralized, rapid mass action?
That's a fascinating and, critical question for the future, for stability.
Mhm.
A lot to think about there. Thank you so much for joining us for this discussion. Let's meet again next Thursday for another exciting deep dive.
Thank you for listening. Join us every Thursday for more insightful conversations.